In class, we looked at traits that show why chimpanzees and humans are closely related species, traits that we share such as homologous structures and similarities in DNA sequences. But what makes us separate species? How and why did we become separate species? How long did it take? These are questions that we will explore in this video on speciation. First, let's quickly review what speciation is and what makes a species a species. In this cladogram, we can see several different speciation events. Here, a common ancestor diverged over time to form two separate species. Similarly, this common ancestor diverged to form this species and perhaps a number of species along the way to lead to this current fruit fly species. These are both speciation events, the formation of separate species. And a species is a group of organisms that can successfully reproduce with each other, but not with another group. So what prevents species from reproducing with other species? Well, reproductive barriers, and there are a variety of these. The two main types of reproductive barriers are prezygotic and postzygotic. Prezygotic barriers prevent gametes from ever fusing. So these barriers prevent the egg and the sperm from getting together. Postzygotic barriers happen after the zygote has formed. With postzygotic barriers, something interferes with the development of the zygote so that the zygote cannot produce offspring on its own. Let's take a look at a few examples of each. Habitat isolation is one example of a prezygotic mating barrier. These snakes are closely related, but because one lives on land and one lives in the water, they are isolated from each other and do not reproduce. Temporal isolation is also prezygotic. These two skunk species reproduce at different times of the year, effectively isolating them reproductively. Sometimes the parts of different species just don't work together. These two snails are separate species because the orientation of their shell prevents the gametes from actually getting together. And behavioral isolation is also prezygotic. In behavioral isolation, there's little or no attraction between the two species. And this could occur because the two different species have two different courtship rituals. You probably remember that the blue-footed booby has a very special dance that it does to attract mates. If you're another bird species and you don't have that dance or those pretty blue feet, you're probably not going to get to mate with the blue-footed booby. Reduced hybrid viability is a postzygotic mating barrier. In the case of this salamander, they can produce offspring, but those offspring don't live very long. They don't live long enough to make offspring of their own. So viability refers to an organism's ability to live in this case. Reduced hybrid fertility sounds the same, but it's different. This is also postzygotic, but in this case, the hybrid is perfectly normal, but it's sterile. So here we have the offspring of a horse and a donkey, which is a mule. The mule is perfectly healthy and does great things for us, but it can't reproduce. Now, during the course of developing reproductive isolation, something known as hybrid zones can develop. And these are periods where your species have not become two separate species and there is still an exchange of gene flow. However, if conditions are right and the species continue to become more and more isolated, eventually you may end up with two separate species from your original null species. But it's very dependent on what happens during this period of hybrid zone, when genes can still be exchanged. So let's explore how that can happen. How can species form? The most common type of speciation is allopatric speciation. Allo means other, and patric refers to fatherland. So in allopatric speciation, we first have geographic isolation, where a population becomes physically separated into two separate populations. This could be a mountain or a lake or a volcanic eruption that creates a huge ravine, something that separates them from actually interacting. And geographic isolation can then become followed by reproductive isolation. And this is where one or more of those mating barriers that we just looked at starts to develop. And this is usually because the two environments are different and are selecting for the evolution of different traits. If the two populations become really, really different, after some time, even if reunited, they may not be able to breed anymore. At this point, they're considered two separate species. However, if they're reunited and they're not that different, they might still be the same species. It all depends on if they can reproduce with each other. Here's a great example of allopatric speciation with these two squirrel species. At one point quite similar, but because they're separated by this great gap, the geographical isolation was then followed by reproductive isolation. A less common type of speciation is known as sympatric speciation. Sym meaning same, and patric referring to fatherland again. So in this type of speciation, we have a population that becomes reproductively isolated, but you've probably noticed that there's no geographic isolation involved. So that's why this is called a sym for same. The population stays in the same area, but something happens to make them become reproductively isolated. There's a couple ways this could happen. Sexual selection is often one form of sympatric speciation. In this case, we have our population, which is diverse. There's blue and green, what looks like dinosaurs, but the blue dinosaurs prefer to mate with each other, and the green dinosaurs prefer to mate with each other. So even though there's no geographic barrier preventing reproduction, they basically impose a mating barrier on themselves. And over time, the blue dinosaurs become different enough that they're reproductively isolated from the green dinosaurs. Sympatric speciation. No geographic isolation, but reproductive isolation. Another important type of sympatric speciation, which occurs mainly in plants, is called polyploidy. Polyploidy is essentially an accident in meiosis that produces extra chromosome numbers. Here we have a plant cell that's supposed to have a diploid number of 6. Now during meiosis, we'd expect to see gametes with 3 chromosomes each, haploid gametes. But something goes wrong, perhaps non-disjunction, and we end up with gametes that each have 6 chromosomes. If these gametes are able to fertilize, we're going to end up with a zygote that now has 12 chromosomes. This is an entirely different species because it's doubled its chromosome number. And if it continues to self-fertilize or finds others like it, this could lead to a whole new population. So polyploidy, an increase in chromosome numbers. Keep in mind this is primarily in plants. In animals, such an event is usually lethal. So how quickly does speciation happen? Well, not very quickly, unless you're a bacteria. There are 2 models to explain how quickly it happens. In punctuated equilibrium, the idea is that you've got your common ancestor, and then there is a sudden and rapid speciation event, and then a long period of no change at all. So you've got equilibrium right here, punctuated by some rapid speciation. And this is often supported by the fossil record because we might find fossil remains of 2 very different looking organisms that were related at one point. Another model, gradualism, is the idea that a common ancestor slowly evolved, gradually, small stages, into 2 separate species. And this is sometimes supported by the fossil record by finding transitional fossils. These are fossils that show traits in between one known species and then a more recent species. But oftentimes these transitional fossils are absent from the fossil record, and so it can be difficult to know whether punctuated equilibrium or gradualism is responsible. Most scientists think that both theories can happen. In general, though, it takes a while for speciation events to occur. In plants and animals, anywhere from 4,000 to 40 million years, and on average, speciation takes about 6.5 million years. So you need generation after generation after generation of genes and gene difference is accumulating to get to the point where two groups are actually reproductively isolated. Extinction. Extinction, in a way, is the opposite of speciation, so you might be wondering what it's doing in this slideshow, but extinction does connect. The truth is that most species that ever lived are now extinct. 1% remain of the 99% that ever emerged through speciation events. And extinction happens all the time. As you can see from this graph, the extinction rate varies though. Sometimes we have periods where extinction rate is low, and then we have periods, 5 in particular, where there were mass extinctions. And during these mass extinctions, 50% or more of the Earth's species were lost. These mass extinctions are usually due to major environmental changes like volcanoes, asteroids, climate change, continental drift. The silver lining to extinction events is that it can lead to speciation through a process known as adaptive radiation. In adaptive radiation, we have one common ancestor, and let's say that there's a major environmental change that wipes out a lot of different organisms. Well, that's going to open up many new niches for this population to exploit. So this common ancestor might diverge into several different species over time, given the right environmental conditions. And it's called adaptive radiation because you have many descendant species radiating out from one common ancestor. And you need varied environments to make this happen. Final note, in terms of speciation, we should be pretty concerned right now about the creation of new species because we are destroying them every second. The current extinction rate from this graph is 100 to 1,000 times the normal rate that the fossil record indicates. Hundreds occur each day. And most of these extinctions are due to human actions like habitat destruction and climate change. So our understanding of speciation and how it occurs could contribute to addressing this problem of the current mass extinction. And that concludes our video for the day. Please don't forget to take your poll before you come into class.